Good afternoon. Victoria, thank you for joining me and continuing our conversation on recent legislative activity regarding the surplus bill. I'm Bob Soldner, the Assistant Superintendent of Financial Services for the Madison Metropolitan School District, and I'm excited to continue my conversations about school funding, how it fits together, what it means for the district, and what it means for other districts in the state of Wisconsin. So, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Bob. It's good to be here today. I'm Victoria Stewart. I'm a legislative consultant for the Madison Metropolitan School District and spend a lot of my time in the Capitol working on these very things. So it's a pleasure to be here.
So we've the last time Joe and I talked, we talked about revenue limits and general aids and how the revenue limits work. So I think it's real important to just kind of reground ourselves in the fundamentals of school finance. And in Wisconsin, for the last, since 1996 really, school finance starts with revenue limits, which is a limit on the total revenue a district can receive in general school aids and property taxes. And so once we get that revenue limit calculation, we need to know how much general aids we're getting from the state legislature. That number is subtracted from our revenue limit, which is our maximum property tax levy. So this most recent legislation that we want to talk about was going to provide some additional money for general school aids, which would have been a dollar for dollar property tax relief for not only Madison property taxpayers, but property taxpayers statewide.
Yeah, and actually, so that piece of legislation was Assembly Bill 1. And for those of you who don't know, Assembly Bill 1 was recently introduced or proposed by Governor Evers in collaboration with Republican leadership, and was a $1.8 billion spending bill that would spend down a proposed or a projected budget surplus in the state of Wisconsin. It's a massive spending bill, really, and included quite a bit of money for public education, over $600 million that would have gone to support public schools across the state. It also included quite a bit of money for tax rebates, though. Over half of the bill was, $900 million of the bill was money that would have been returned to taxpayers in a $300 per individual or $600 per family at the maximum reimbursement level. We also saw included in that bill a exemption on tax on overtime and tax on tips in the state, which would have reduced the taxable revenue for the state overall year over year, and that would have been continuous in perpetuity. So, Bob, since you've mentioned this now, and revenue limits were actually a big part of the discussion of Assembly Bill 1, why was this bill important, and specifically, what would have it done for the Madison Metropolitan School District?
Right, the board was hugely important, and really, in the context of the 25-27 state biennial budget, the legislature, for the first time in modern history, did not provide any increases in general school aids, meaning under that revenue limit calculation that we've talked about, any increase through revenue limit, that's through the $325 per student, or in Madison's case, when the voters approved additional spending authority by referendum, that general aids reduces that property tax impact. So $0, first time in modern history, the legislature did not provide any new dollars in a biennial budget. So this bill would have, as you mentioned, would have provided a little over $302.5 million to be exact, in a new type of general school aids, right? Which is real important. So a new type of general school aids, but the important thing is every district would have received a dollar amount that was estimated at the most recent student count information at about $387 per student. For Madison, that's about $10.1 million, would have directly reduced property taxes this fall. It's huge, right? And so take Madison and the 420 other school districts, the same thing would have happened. They would have received additional state aids that would have been a dollar for dollar property tax reduction. No new monies to spend, but a property tax relief. So
that property tax, we've seen property taxes across the state skyrocket, right? And
yes.
It's a really big piece of conversation right now, and a huge part of affordability for just being able to live right now in the state of Wisconsin. So a dollar for dollar property tax decrease sounds great. The reason that this would not have been new spendable money for schools, though, had to do with revenue limits specifically,
yes.
Didn't it?
Yes, it does. So the type of aid, general school aids, is only used to offset property tax increases under revenue limit. It's not new money that can be spent. Unlike the other provision in the bill that would have provided $315 million over 2 years. And really that $350 million in 2 years, definitely new money, but should not be considered new money. Really should be considered the legislature and governor were going to meet what they already said they were going to do, that is refund 42% of our special education costs this school year, the 25-26 school year, and 45% in the school year 26-27, the following school year. So 315 in new dollars, but 315 million statewide to fund what the legislature already said they were going to fund, right? The problem with it, and why they could say they were going to fund 42 and 45% reimbursement, is the legislature creates that appropriation as a sum certain appropriation, not a sum sufficient appropriation, which they could have done and did not do. And if they would have had a sum sufficient, basically it says if the state says they're going to get 42% reimbursement on those costs, you get 42% reimbursement regardless of your costs. In the case how they fund it, they set a dollar amount in the appropriation. If there's not enough money to cover all those costs, you get less than 42%. This year, the DPI is estimating about 35%. I'm hoping it gets up to close to 38%. We won't know that till the end of June. Based on those numbers, next year we're looking at, with no new monies, probably 40%, a little under 40% reimbursement versus 45%. So that $315 million for Madison, it's $4 million that we could have in our revenues for this year, and about $11 million next year. So
yeah, and
it's a big deal.
It is a big deal. And part of the reason it's a big deal, though, is because Wisconsin does do these categorical aids very differently than other states do. Like some certain and some sufficient are not terms that we hear when we talk about school funding in other states, right?
Yeah, correct.
And so when the legislature passes a biennial budget to say that we're going to fund 42% of your special education costs this year and 45% of your special education costs next year, in other states, some sufficient would be included in that language. And in Wisconsin, we haven't done that yet. So this bill, Assembly Bill 1, talked about increasing this to 42% and then 50% next year.
Correct.
Was some sufficient language included in that?
No, it was not, unfortunately, right? Which is like, so there's a lot of things how the legislature does it. I would say primarily the legislature does appropriate, not just with public schools, but other departments, some certain appropriations. But there are times when they choose some sufficient appropriations. They say this much per money, $12,000 per child, or $10,000 per child. And if you're a private school participating in the private school voucher program, you get what the state says you're going to get. Because why? The legislature created some sufficient appropriations. Same with independent charter schools. They were told they're going to get X per student. They don't get prorated on that. They get the budget. They know they're going to get that state money. It's a sum sufficient appropriation. So it's not like the legislature doesn't understand the difference between the two. They just have chosen not to fully fund special education reimbursement, which is unfortunate.
It is. And so in Assembly Bill 1, what we just looked at, like this special education money was a really big deal because the way that categorical aids work in the state of Wisconsin, that would have been spendable revenue that schools would have still been able to submit for and to get this year, right?
Yeah. Yes, correct.
And that would have been, like, that's huge. Like, we hear about school districts across the state right now that have failed referenda that are, I mean, you know, one close to us is going to take a vote of dissolution. So this would have been really important spendable revenue for schools this year.
Yeah. The Houston School Board, they actually did vote to consider dissolution, and they're actually going through the process. I was just talking to the finance person for Houston School District a couple weeks ago. They've already tuitioned out to a neighboring school district all their students for the 26-27 school year. So they've already laid off all their teachers. They are on the track to ceasing to exist, to dissolve in terms of state language, in terms of school district reorganization. So significant, right? And there's many districts that go to referendum, and unfortunately, they're a lot like Madison, right? Our community really supports our public schools. They have overwhelmingly voted yes. 2024, we went to referendum for $100 million in operating over 4 years, $507 million for facilities. The largest questions on the ballot in fall of 2024, 70% approval rating for each questions, also the largest support. So Madison really supports our public schools through referendum, and then they pay most of that on property tax. Because of the way the general school aids formula works, Madison just doesn't get a lot. 90% of our shared costs on the property tax. Other districts are not as fortunate, right? They either haven't explained it to their voters, but they've gotten no votes. And so they have to lay off teachers, they have to reduce programming, They have to think about consolidating. Boards vote to consider dissolving, right? Because they don't have enough local funds to support a school.
And I think we know that public schools are the backbone of communities, and so to see these decisions, like these tough decisions being made around the state is really disheartening. I know I heard from the Dodgeville School District that they are going to be going to their 4th referenda now in November again. So hopefully the state can step in and do some work here to alleviate some of the pressure that we've seen on property taxes. One thing I think it's really important about the special education reimbursement portion that we saw here in Assembly Bill 1, because it created a lot of conversation, was even though we did not see the language for some sufficient reimbursements in here, we did see enough money put into the pot here that it would have likely been some sufficient in practice. Is that right? That
is correct. And actually, Assembly Bill 1 would have, based on our costs that we know today, which are almost final, not quite yet, would have actually been 42.7% reimbursement in 25-26, above the stated appropriation, above the stated 42%. But based on cost today and what we would expect to be in 26-27, I think everyone agrees legitimately funding 50%, which, again, talk about modern history. Modern history, 50% special education reimbursement from the state of Wisconsin is unheard of. I've been doing school finance since the late 90s, 96, 97. And I mean, even 2 years ago, us talking about a 29% reimbursement on special education was unheard of, right? We were in the low 20s. And so kudos to the legislature and governor at 42 and 45%. Downside is they didn't fund that commitment. But even to be talking about 42 and 45, it's a win. It's a great step in the right direction, but it's not enough. It's not enough.
I agree. Yeah. And I tend, like when we first saw these numbers and I saw 42%, I was a little hesitant to want to jump with joy over that, because it felt like that was something that should have been provided for in the last biennial budget. But this increase to 50% certainly would have been meaningful. And can you talk a little bit about like what that would have done for us moving forward? Because there has been some conversation that because that language was not some sufficient, that this would not have fixed any structural issues that we have in the state when in regard to school funding.
Sure. That's a good question. The way the state budgets is they take the fiscal year's appropriated amounts, in this case 26-27, and they really roll that forward as the adjusted base starting the next conversations in the 27-29 biennial budget conversations. So we've already talked about the money that they were going to appropriate in some certain appropriation really had us at 50% reimbursement. So that becomes the base for any conversations moving forward, right? It would take an act of the legislature to change that 50%, or they'd have to appropriate no new monies. But the base would have been set at 50% and the dollar amounts to back that up.
Excellent. Thanks for talking about that, Bob. So I guess we know a little bit about what the bill would have done now, but how does the failure of this bill, so the bill did not move forward, and it moved forward through the assembly, right? It was brought to the assembly floor about 2 weeks ago and did pass. And then it moved to the Senate, and it did not pass through the Senate. We saw 3 Republicans vote no against it, and we saw the entire Democratic Senate caucus vote no against it as well. So it failed on the Senate floor, a 15-18 vote. What does that failure do? And what does that mean now for school districts across the state?
So at a big picture look, what it means is if, first of all, federal and state requirement for districts to provide individualized education programs for students that need plans, IEPs, for students that need that extra help, right? So we're required to provide those services. I tell people all the time, Madison Metropolitan School District does a great job, even compared to our peers, in providing programs that meet students' needs, and we do that. So we do that no matter what it's going to cost us, right? Based on our kids, based on our IEPs, we provide great services. That's awesome. We're going to continue to do that. But if we don't get, say, like we talked about, if we're not getting that $11 million in additional aid to offset those costs in 26-27, what that means is I need to take $11 million from our Fund 10, $11 million that we could fund to schools where the kids with IEPs are attending and kids without IEPs are attending, more wraparound services, more mental health services, smaller class sizes, right? All the costs that it takes to run, we cannot do that because that money is needed to cover those costs in Fund 27, right? So, this year, $62 million, depending on how much we're ultimately thinking we're going to get in 26-27, that impacts that Fund 10 balance transfer, right? So that's what it does. It impacts our whole district. and I mean our whole district, kids with IEPs and kids without IEPs, when you have to take money out of Fund 10 to cover those costs, that either the federal government hasn't lived up to their commitment, and they haven't since the early 70s when they created the legislation, and neither has the state, right? So that puts it back onto local taxpayers to cover that.
And I think, like this wasn't, as I mentioned in the beginning, like education was not the only thing that was included in Assembly Bill 1, right? Like we saw a lot of tax rebates there, and it's important to note that the Legislative Fiscal Bureau did come out with a memo stating that they could see that the passage of this package specifically could have created a $2.9 billion deficit in the state's budget moving forward. And so there was some rationale for not passing this on the Senate floor, and I think that's probably what some Democratic leaders were looking at. But it doesn't stop the fact that this money would have been hugely useful for public schools and for school districts around the state, right? Correct,
absolutely. And I'm not going to get into an argument about forecasting and projecting 3 years out. It's tricky business. It's tricky business, right? But I will say this, since the legislature passed the current 25-27 biennial budget, we all have been talking, Democrats, Republicans, the governor, and school districts saying, why didn't you give any money on general school aids? You have a $2+ billion surplus, right? Those projections were put forth by the governor's budget office and the Legislative Fiscal Bureau. And they were numbers that we used for leading up to AB1, right? Mm-hmm. And so were there estimates made to get those projections? Absolutely, just like there is every 2-year budget cycle. And so how did all of a sudden those estimates change that dramatically? I don't know. But I think that's something one could look at. But again, I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying that's 3 years out from now, and public schools are in dire straits. We need the money. We needed the state support now, and it has caused budget holes for us right now.
Yeah, and so I think it's important to talk about what next steps are, right? So we saw this fail on the Senate floor, and after that, and I think one of the things that superintendents have been talking about around the state is we kind of didn't see more negotiation, right? One of the things that a lot of superintendents, and I know the Big Five superintendents were talking about, was okay, so that pass didn't work. Let's get back to the table and let's figure out something that does work so that we can save these public schools around the state. But what does that look like, and like where do you think that we need to go from here?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is the folks in the legislature and the governor need to take a look at their revenue projections, right? You do need to agree on your revenue projections, right? And whatever those revenue projections are, I think the fact is we all believe there is a surplus right now, whether it's $2.5 billion or $1.5 billion. Now, let me remind everybody, that's in addition to a $2 billion plus rainy day fund, right? So if projections were terrible 3 years from now, the state has a $2+ billion rainy day fund that they can tap or use for any unexpected circumstances. Tax revenues are down, the economy tanks, whatever happens, right? So we're not talking about the $2 billion rainy day fund. That's in the bank. We're talking about in addition to the $2 billion. Is it $1 billion? Is it $2.5 billion on top of that $2 billion? What is it? Decide what that is, and then give schools some money, give taxpayers some money, do whatever you can get to get the votes to get it done, right? But it is really, like we talked about, unbelievable that the legislature didn't appropriate anything for general school aid, which is a dollar for dollar property tax reduction. And really unbelievable they didn't fund at least the 42 and 45%, right? I mean, they said they were going to do it.
They did.
They should fund it.
Yeah, and I think that we often talk about the term "some certain" when we're referring to categorical aids as really broken promises. Like if we don't put enough money in that pot to be able to fund those percentages, then those percentages don't mean anything. And school business officials around the state have had to historically continue to budget for something that's going to come in 3, 4, 5% under what the legislature agrees to in a biennial budget, right?
Yeah. And there's other ways if they want to make improvements. If the legislature wants some more certainty on how much it's going to cost to refund special education costs, there's other ways of calculating that reimbursement. There's other ways of paying that. But literally, Madison, along with every other school district, we won't know until late June of 2026 what our dollar amount reimbursement is going to be for the 25-26 school year. That ends on June 30th, 2026, right? So depending on how close they are, we've got a budget hole, right? And you have to be ready. Now, thankfully, our board has made some good decisions through voter support at referendum, we have a fund balance to be able to handle anything that would be way out of what we projected in terms of our revenues and expenditures. But a lot of districts are razor thin, right? And they don't have that ability. Madison does.
Right.
Madison does.
So, Bob, I know that we talked a little bit, so we've talked a lot about the special education reimbursement part of this package and the some certain nature of it. The other thing that we heard about was obviously the general aid appropriation. And this general aid was a new type of general aid, as we heard, that was, as you mentioned earlier, was going to be like a dollar for dollar property tax reduction, but not new spendable revenue for schools.
Correct.
We didn't see this program sunsetting. This wasn't going to be a one-time program that we saw from this new type of general aid. And importantly, this general aid distribution was not going to go through the equalization formula that we have been using, Wisconsin's been using to distribute general aid for, 30 years now?
Yeah, that's true. And I think I understand what they're trying to do, right? Like districts like Madison, even if the legislature would have just put $300 million into the general school aids formula, Madison would have got $0. We would have got nothing. Because the way the current general equalization aid formula that hasn't been updated since 1996, right? The factors need to be updated. It needs to do better what it was intended to do. And really, it's just updating the factors to be CPI, to be inflationary increases over the years. But without that, what they did is they basically created per pupil categorical aid calculation inside general school aids to be able to say every dollar into the general school aids appropriation is a dollar for dollar reduction under the current revenue limit law, right? So they in essence created a first draw of the $6 billion used for equalization aid, only to pay out that $302.5 million. So.
And this is probably where some of the conversation around like not fixing a structural problem with school funding came from, right? Because we know that property taxes are a massive issue for people across the state right now. As we spoke about, it's decreasing the affordability of living in Wisconsin. So that property tax reduction is desperately needed. It doesn't fix the funding formula that we're looking at for. So what would we be looking at, and maybe either from another action from the legislature or in the next biennial budget, really, to move forward?
Yeah, I think first of all, I mean, the equalization aid formula is complicated. It's 3 tiers of funding based on costs at certain tiers and based on guaranteed value in terms of equalized property value per student. We have 421 school districts, so it's complicated and the numbers can move around. But basically what the equalization aid formula says is you use these factors, again, which haven't been updated in 30 years, and then applies money. And in essence, when the formula went from 2 tiers to 3 tiers back in 96, 97, they added a tier, the primary tier it's called. And basically that was, think of it as like everyone got at least some aid, right? On the first $1,000 of cost, based on the guaranteed, everyone got a little bit of general school aids, right? And then they went to a second tier and a third tier. So some people have been talking, including me, for decades, right? I'm a long time in this business, about why don't we update the factors, right? It's been 30 years. You could have done it last biennial budget. You could have done the biennial budget before that, and the one before that. And one, it's complicated, right? People don't intuitively understand how it works, but it's like, it's a factor that was established 30 years ago. I'm just saying index it to inflation, right? And you can do that. And what that does is it takes Madison from what we are currently, 90% of our shared costs are on the property taxes, 10% are state aid. And like I said, that's not going to get better unless the fundamental law changes. And so I don't think it's too much to ask that Madison property taxpayers should only fund 70% of our costs instead of 90%, right? Some number in between, and raise everybody's boats across the board. So, which I think can be done.
Yeah, that's we've done a lot of research around the burden that property tax owners, the property owners have in different cities and around different school districts. And so in Madison, I think, what is it, 10.8%, 10.1%? Anyway, about 90% of our general funding comes from our property tax owners. Where in a different district, like Milwaukee, for instance, only 34% of their general revenue has to come from property owners. And so when we look at that and we understand that like that's why the burden of property taxes in a city like Madison can be so much higher,
Yeah.
because we desperately need to do some of that revision at the state level.
Yeah, yeah. I think in addition to those, what I call updating the factors of the formula, many other states include a weighting of students, right? Some students need more help than other students, and there's some common factors to say a child in poverty might need more help than a middle income or upper income child. And so it's called weighting, right? So you give some weight. Instead of 1.0 FTE for a child in poverty, maybe 1.2, 1.4. Same with a child with an IEP. They need more services than a student without an IEP, so maybe you weight that child. And then districts that are serving a higher percentage of children with IEPs, children that are low income, maybe English as a second language, weight that also as 1.2. You're providing more services compared to some other district that doesn't have as many children with those unique set of needs, is a way for the state to help fund that. So that's another way. It's another step, but it's one that we should be going on.
Okay, so I guess then just like to close this out. So next steps that we're looking at from the legislature, right? Like we would love it if everyone came back to Madison and continued to work on something that was going to provide immediate relief for public school districts around the state right now.
Yes, we would love that.
Okay. Outside of that, we are going to be heading in pretty quickly here to the next budget cycle. And so what are public schools looking for, and what is the Madison Metropolitan School District looking for in that budget cycle next year?
I think much what was in AB1. I think the state continuing to take a look at how much is a fair share for the state to cover in certain costs, particularly students with special needs, special education costs. I think providing more money in general aids, either continuing with this new method of really a per pupil calculation within the equalization aid. I really don't care how they do it. I really don't like that method, but that's just me. I think the state's saying we need to share in the cost no matter if you're a Madison Metropolitan School District or a small rural school district in the middle of Wisconsin that's reliant more on property taxes than state aid. All of our districts need more help. We need property tax relief, right? And we need the state to kind of return to where they used to be in really sharing more of the cost of the public schools than the local taxpayer. That's what needs to happen.
So special education reimbursement,
Yes.
additional general aid money that's linked to inflation, that increases
Yes.
with inflation?
Yes.
Okay.
Some sufficient.
Some sufficient special education
Yeah.
reimbursement, inflationary linked general aid appropriations,
Yeah.
and property tax reductions
Yes.
around the state, right?
Yes, correct.
And I think that if we were to go all the way back to January, that's pretty much what Governor Evers proposed when we were talking about this surplus spend initially. We were talking about special education reimbursement, some sufficient at 42 and 45. We were talking about $350 million into general aid, and we were talking about money into the school levy tax credit, which is something that directly decreases property tax burdens, right?
Yes, it does. After the fact. School levy tax credit is even more complicated than the equalization aid formula in terms of how it impacts taxpayers. But it is property tax reduction.
So I think ultimately we have a roadmap forward,
We do have a roadmap forward.
and we have money in the surplus.
I believe we have
We have a
sufficient
projected
funds in the surplus, right? No matter what they agree what it is, right?
Okay, and so now we just need a legislature and the
We need-
action from the
We need
legislature.
legislature and governor to come back and take care of it. There's still time, right? In the meantime, we continue to talk, we continue to collaborate, we continue to try to explain a very complicated thing, which is called school finance in Wisconsin, unnecessarily so, I believe. But there's a lot of us that have been around, well, maybe not a lot. There's a handful of us been around for a long time, including me, that can talk. We can answer questions, right? I don't understand that, or I would like to try this. What would this do instead of what you're talking about, right? Have a conversation, right? I think the state is getting ready to step up, really, and actually return to their former commitment to funding public schools in Wisconsin, because they are. To me, public schools are the engine of a community. It's business-oriented, it's family-oriented. Public schools are make or break a community, right? They do.
Strong schools, strong communities.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Good talk. We'll talk again. Folks, continue to come into our podcast. I'm kind of enjoying this. It's a new role for me. I'm having fun. So talk soon.